Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Blue Morpho podcast. I'm your host, Maestro Hamilton, and I'm excited today to have Jon Chavez on the show with me. He got introduced to me through a close friend and has done some incredible work in the field. And so this is an honor. Thank you, Jon, for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a long time in terms of getting this vision going with the DMT Quest thing. I'm just interested to go ahead and discuss the journey to get where we're at and hopefully where we're going over the next couple decades, because this is going to be a lifelong project, not something that's, one and done or, a few more studies. So, yeah, we got big plans for the world. Got a big plans for everybody, really.
Well, you just dropped some big letters and a big word. So DMT, for those that don't know about it, that are listeners or only know about it through ayahuasca, for you, what is DMT?
So DMT is a psychedelic compound that's found throughout nature. Obviously, you're well versed in that in terms of thousands of plants, maybe millions of plants having DMT in certain amounts. The interesting thing about DMT compared to other psychedelics is that it's actually produced in the mammalian system. So human body, all the mammals tested thus far. So it just leads to a lot of conversations, a lot of interesting conversations, from very subtle things like moments of insight to all the way up to aliens. So I think that's one of the most interesting things about DMT is that it's a conversation starter. The conversation doesn't end with DMT, but it really interjects a big umbrella in terms of the potential for all mystical topics to somehow be integrated with that discussion.
And what's your, inspiration behind DMT Quest? Like, what is it? Describe it for the listeners. Help us understand this mission.
Yeah, so basically, I had a mystical experience back in 2013 that changed my perspective of what was possible in terms of the human potential, human experience. Prior to that, I'd never really had any interest in psychedelics, mysticism, spirituality, consciousness, anything of that nature. And then my life pretty much got flipped upside down. I was having a health crisis leading up to that. I was 33 years old at the time, and I had a blood clot in my lung when I was 32, so the year before, and then just like health problems leading up to that. And at the age of 33 in 2013, I had a mystical experience that I guess you can describe it as Kundalini awakening. It happened following a massive purge of the body in terms of cleansing the body. It wasn't something that I planned. It was pretty much an accident, but we kind of know at this point that a lot of things are planned by the cosmic mind. So anyhow, I had the experience. It was a feeling of electricity. It was like I was plugged in for the first time in my life. I felt like a connection with a greater force. I can only describe it as, the force of God at the time. And I also started to have these experiences of electric surges throughout my body, but also a sense of being able to control my autonomic nervous system based on intent, which was very strange because I'd never heard of Wim Hof or any sort of that work at that time. Just to give you an example, after I induced the purge and I had the feeling of electricity, it lasted for 12 weeks, but the day of the purge and the few days after, anytime I would touch a piece of metal, it would get like really hot, like really fast. And it was just very strange. So I'd never experienced that before. Electrical appliances started to go in and out in terms of their operational status. And then one of the nights following the purge was, I don't know if your feet get cold at night, but I just had the insight to go ahead and see if I can direct this electricity within my body to my feet to get them warm. And I initially was like, okay, let's do 1 foot at a time. Right foot, get warm. And then I envisioned the electricity going down, and within like 2 seconds, it felt like hot. And then I grabbed my foot with both my hands, and I felt the foot was hot, but the left foot was still cold. So it wasn't like a just a systemic thing. It was targeted. And I did the same thing with my left foot. And I was like, okay, wow, this is happening really fast. I don't know exactly what this is, but it feels amazing in terms of the overall space. And I didn't know that your intent could have such an effect on, you're signaling it within your body. The next day, I'm sitting with with my girlfriend at the time, and I get the same insight, but this time, instead of just visualizing within my body, I was like, let me see if I can connect with her with the same sort of visualization, but just through the air. And normally something like that would sound crazy, but I just went ahead and tried it. And when I went ahead and visualized, as soon as the visualization got very vivid, which took about maybe 5 or 6 seconds, her head jolted back because I didn't tell her what I was doing. And at that point, it seemed as though there could be a connection between two people through the air. So it wasn't like a nervous system solely thing. It was like your visualizations could have an effect on matter outside of the body. And then the next thing that came to mind was, well, maybe that's how telepathy works. Maybe over the connection that was made via the visualization, you can send images that are in your mind to another mind. And that actually happened like 3 or 4 times in a row. It wasn't like, pick a color, black or white or red or blue. It was like anything. And at that point, it made me realize telepathy was real. This whole thing of energy seemed to be real. Mind you, she had been diagnosed with lupus a couple of years ago, and when I touched her, there was like a surge of energy that went from my body into hers, and she felt like a big relief of pain almost instantaneously, while I felt like a surge of energy being sucked out of my body. It was a very strange sensation, but you know, things happen so fast from the awakening in the sense of telepathy being real, the concept of energy potentially being real in terms of like the hands-on healing I'd always heard about, like in religious texts, things that I never really paid attention to before. And it really got me interested in the human potential. And that's really what started my journey into all this. But most importantly, I would say that it was the communication aspect of this journey that really got me interested in endogenous DMT, because prior to this, I'd never heard about DMT. I tried to tell my cousin at the time, he was in medical school, and I knew that he was interested in psychedelics and altered states. And, I tried to tell him about the experience that I had had. And he said, he just kind of brushed it off. He's like, just look up DMT. And that's why I looked up DMT. I saw the Spirit Molecule book. I picked it up, read it. And at that point, it was, I tried to go ahead and explain my experience to a lot of people, and they weren't really open to it until I started to integrate the concept of endogenous DMT, the molecule of the mystic, potentially being correlated with these sorts of experiences. Prior to this awakening experience, I had actually worked in the biotech industry for about a decade. And a lot of the scientists that I worked with weren't open to even hearing about the experience until I started to describe it in the form of DMT upregulation, changes in the brainwave state, changes in electrophysiology, correlating with these experiences and abilities. And then I realized that there was a certain openness once we started to integrate that sort of language with that sort of mindset. And then I created an anonymous blog. I just put the initials JC, and I try to, because I'm not, like my degree is not in science, but I just decided to try my hand at being like a science writer of sorts in terms of the biomechanics of mysticism. And I did that on the anonymous blog for several years. And after a while, got traction. Dennis Mckenna started reading it and spreading it around. And then I got invited to these DMT symposiums in the UK, where they had a lot of leading researchers in it, the Tyringham Initiative, guys like Roland Griffiths and Ralph Messner from Harvard and all that. And I ended up compiling the blog into a couple books, just focused on biomechanics of the mystical in terms of meditation, breathwork, hypnosis, pretty much all the altered states you could ever think of. Just trying to paint the picture that, these things are not just, there's magic and mechanisms. They could be both. It's not one or the other. So I was trying to, just give a platform for that potentiality. And, I got in contact with researchers in the DMT space, specifically endogenous DMT. So Jima Borjigan from the University of Michigan, I got in contact with her about her research, because she showed that DMT is produced in the pineal gland in a 2013 study. And I was wondering why there wasn't more research regarding, endogenous DMT. And she stated there was no budget. So that's really what alerted me to the fact that I needed to get more involved, and I needed to help fundraise for these scientists that, she had told me that every year at the end of the semester, she had a line of young PhD students that want to study DMT, but she had to turn them away because she didn't have a budget. So that's really what drove me to start DMT Quest. And, alongside the awakening experience was to get funds for these scientists who want to study this interesting molecule that seems to drive interesting conversations. And I think a lot of what reality is based on is conversations. Can you find a place that two parties can meet to have these sort of controversial discussions about topics that people normally wouldn't discuss publicly or would be shying away from? And yeah, that's kind of really what started my path on this. And the first DMT Quest documentary, we shot it in 2020. It was released in 2021, and it featured Jon Dean's research at University of Michigan, a study he published in 2019, which showed that DMT seems to be produced throughout the brain, not just in the pineal gland. It seems to be produced at the cortical plexus, at the cortex, visual cortex. And most importantly, it seems to be produced at similar levels to serotonin and dopamine in normal waking mammals. So that changed the discussion of endogenous DMT altogether, because prior to that, there was a perspective that DMT is only produced maybe during near-death experiences, maybe during dreams. But this study alludes to the notion that DMT is modulating our everyday waking reality, and that maybe reality is more malleable when our levels of DMT changing based on altered states. I mean, that's one of the hypotheses we have, and plan to do a lot more research to go ahead and either prove or disprove it and try to understand it a little better.
If there are so much DMT being produced in the brain kind of unilaterally, what purpose does it have? Is there any idea yet about what actual role it's playing in cognition?
That's a great question. Yeah, there's still so many questions, not too many answers. We're still in the process of securing more funding to understand it better. But there's a perspective that it potentially has a role to play in mood modulation, neuroplasticity, because there's a company called Algernon Pharmaceuticals up in Canada who's been doing subpsychedelic levels of DMT for stroke. So this is exogenous DMT, but very low level, subpsychedelic, something that's not going to change your visual perception. And they've been seeing levels that are at the same amount as endogenous levels, modulating neuroplasticity. And that's what it seems to be an important aspect of DMT in the brain, that it's not just like a massive dose that causes neuroplasticity, but just constant levels are constantly maybe adding repair to the brain, because we know that DMT acts as a anti-inflammatory, antioxidant. So there might be a consistent role that it's always playing, that the body breaks down, the brain breaks down, but it's always revitalizing itself autonomically, an autonomic process. But yeah, there's still a lot more information to be had with research regarding its primary role. And it might not have just one role, it could have a dozen roles, right? I think we need to be cognizant of that it's not just mystical type experiences. It could be mood modulation. It could be repair of the brain.
Yeah, I mean, with ayahuasca ceremonies and the amount of DMT that's typically found in ayahuasca, there's a direct correlation between utilizing the DMT component, which is actually from chacruna. It's not from the ayahuasca itself at all, in terms of, or very minimal, and a recognition that it has multiple purposes in the ceremony. It enlightens, it makes the rest of the experience much more colorful and clear. And so one aspect of it is vision, but there's also a great shift in cognition that you experience and the ability to process information. And then there's a huge shift in mood associated with it as well. And then there's also an aspect of it associated to spiritual connection or mystical connection. And I started to do my own studies of separating the ayahuasca vine from the chacruna, because typically it's all combined into just one elixir, one tea. So I started to separate it out to see which components were doing which parts. was really surprised at how dynamic the introduction of DMT into the ayahuasca experience is. So if you drink pure ayahuasca vine, which is the MAOI, mostly harmaline and harmine, into the body, and then don't add DMT to it, you only get a very minor part of the experience, not a major part of the experience. You get like the first 20, 30% of what you would think of as, oh, that's the ayahuasca. And you would kind of put all of the emphasis on it. But actually the massive transformation in the mind state and brain state that comes through and the shift in consciousness that takes place is part the combination and part purely the interjection of the DMT into the experience. Wondering how that resonates from the research that you guys have been doing.
Interesting, because I like to use the term endohuasca to describe the various components that the mammalian system produces. You mentioned harmine from the ayahuasca vine, and humans actually produce harmine. There's evidence. There's plenty of papers showing that, and we also produce istatin, which is another monoamine oxidase inhibitor, neurocatin, which is another MAOI. And alongside DMT, we also produce bufotenine, which is 5-hydroxy-DMT, as well as a 5-MeO-DMT. So it's a little bit more complex of a blend, I think, that we produce internally within us. How that's upregulated during altered states, I mean, this is stuff that I think the public wants to know for many decades now. Is there a correlation with this endohuasca system upregulation? Is there a tie-in with the change in the brainwaves, right? Because we know that during altered states, it seems to induce a faster, you're operating at a faster speed. You're operating at a gamma speed rather than, the alpha beta frequency that we're normally at during our normal consciousness. Interestingly enough, ayahuasca also induces the same elevation in the speed of the processing. And, we're seeing a lot of overlap in terms of, the effects of meditation, breath work, quieting, the default mode network, similarly to the way ayahuasca and psilocybin does. Not exactly the same, but there's definitely overlap. So, I think we're still just scratching the surface, and a lot more to be done in a combination of, in vitro animal and human studies.
That's fascinating. When I think of people taking DMT externally compared to what they're self-producing and regulating, there's a massive influx of it, and then this altered state experience. How often do you think people are having a nature of an altered state experience because of the DMT being produced inside their body?
Well, some people would state that, just the dream state alone is being modulated by, I wouldn't say just DMT, it's probably all the monoamine neurotransmitters and more that we don't even know of. In terms of like a meditation or, breath work, things like that, there's so many mechanical changes that are also taking place during those, like especially breath work, right? Because when you do breath work, you're changing the cerebral spinal fluid dynamics, the cerebral blood flow, hydroxyl radical production. From that, there's a lot going on there that's not just DMT going up. It's a whole surge of neurotransmitters, and we've seen that even in the cardiac arrest study that Jima Borjigan did in 2015, I believe. There was dozens of neurotransmitters that surged, that went up 1,000%, 1,500%, 2,000%, that seemed to be modulating that cardiac arrest or potential near-death experience. The end result does seem to coincide with a big surge in gamma wave production. And, the thing with the gamma wave, is mainly known to be between maybe 35 hertz and above to maybe 150 hertz. That's considered high gamma. But it seems that there's a lot more information to dive into regarding even above that 150 hertz. So like 500 hertz, 1,000 hertz, 2,000 hertz. Guys who has a really interesting hypothesis regarding consciousness, especially altered states, is a Stuart Ameroff. He's one of the founders of the OR theory. It's not really my specialty, but he really focuses on the speed of the transmission and the information being processed. And that's really the key to these altered states.
In your experience, when you went through your own altered state, what did you think was happening?
Well, that's a great question. I didn't attribute it just to biochemical changes. I definitely looked at it from a mystical perspective and like an internal electric perspective. It felt like pure electricity. That's the only way I could describe it. It felt like maybe there was an increase in cerebral blood flow being happening and cerebral spinal fluid. It just felt like a turnover in the brain was like massive, like all the time. It was very strange. It's almost like when you do breath work for maybe 20 minutes, it felt like that, but all the time, where it was kind of like you were kind of buzzing, you kind of feel refreshed in a certain way. Um, yeah, it was very transformative, obviously, because it lasted about 12 weeks, and even some things linger on today. But yeah, I definitely felt like I'd stepped into a new reality. That was like the sensation that I felt. I was just like, I felt like I changed, like my body had morphed into something else. And, at that point, I was just aware that there was more to life. There was more than the material world. But there still has to be some sort of bridge between the material world and whatever you want to deem it, the spiritual world, the mystical world, the esoteric world. I feel like that's still a very important uh, aspect to bridge those worlds.
After the 12 weeks, what happened? As it started to wane and go away, what were you thinking?
Hmm. I mean, at that point, life had changed, right? Because things that weren't interesting to me were interesting to me. Concepts like reincarnation, concepts like, has this ever happened to anybody else in history? And I was amazed to find that there was a lot of literature from the early 1900s by legitimate scientists that all this stuff had been looked at, had been like, hypothesized on. I didn't even know that the EEG was created by Hans Berger, who had experienced some form of telepathy, and he built the EEG to actually study that phenomenon. It's a device they use up until today in all the top neuroscience institutes. So, I basically started reading a book a day, trying to understand, what's the history of this? Why don't other people know about it? Why didn't I know about it? Why is it so taboo to talk about it? And that's where I got the most transformed, was just knowing how much I don't know. And just a very humbling experience in that regard was, how sure are you of anything? And I ended up getting more grounded, just reading more books and trying to decide which way I wanted to go at that point. Because I had dabbled in teaching people telepathy, and found that that wasn't really a big deal. It was pretty easy with the right people, and it was like, is this something that I want to do, for the future? It wasn't. I'm much more interested in the communicative aspects of, pretty much all altered states and the human potential, because I think that there's a lot that could impact society regarding not just understanding mystical states, but also healing the body. I think healing the body is one of the most important things to heal the mind. And that's what I realized, that they're just so intimately intertwined. I think that was one of my biggest realizations, was not just the concept of the gut brain, but knowing the gut brain and the changes, the drastic changes that you can have in your emotions, your processing, your perspective once the gut brain is changed. So yeah, that's kind of one of the things I believe that ayahuasca has a leg up on all the other psychedelics, is that it seems to act so profoundly on the entire digestive tract from top to bottom. And I think like future research in that specific field of what is it doing to the digestive tract to having such a profound effect on our nervous system and our emotions afterwards. I think that's going to be like a super intriguing field.
Yeah, ayahuasca is a powerful, really a tea elixir in that way. Like if you don't add other plants that exacerbate it, a lot of people add tobacco to it to try to increase the potency of its purgative quality. But if you just leave it pure ayahuasca vine and chacruna, it takes a while to work on the gut. So first it goes through the stomach, and people will go through the phase that I call onset, which is just, I describe it as adjusting to the fact that they consumed ayahuasca. So now they're in a period of time where they're not comfortable yet. And so they're adjusting, they fidget, they roll around, they sometimes throw up, etc. And then there will be this experience where you'll feel like the ayahuasca will start to move into the gut. And as it does, there's a dramatic shift in the quality of the experience of it. It's not just visionary in its context anymore. There's a deep feeling in gnosis that comes through that part of the experience. It often causes purging out of the colon, and you defecate, you let go of a lot of different kinds of experiences. And I think one of the most profound experience I hear people talk about is that they'll go into the toilet with a very difficult mind, whether it's depressed or has a lot of pathology associated with it, and they'll release through the colon, and they'll come out having released their mind, and they'll have a completely different mind after that experience. I've heard of a lot of people over the years that say they pooped out depression, they pooped out addiction, and this tremendous transformation will have taken place. And that's one of the miraculous things about it, is I've thought to myself, we go to the bathroom every day. It's not every day that you get a huge mind update and that you get a real healing experience from that. What do you think's going on there? I mean, it doesn't have to be science, just a hunch or from your research. What do you think's happening? Why is that connection being made, and that's even happening?
Yeah, I have a hunch that, just like they like to discuss the default mode network in the brain, I feel as though there's something probably there in the gut that could be a mirror of the default mode network in the gut. And because ayahuasca can get deep in there and activate the receptors, it could probably restructure, the gut default mode network that holds on to those emotions. And then, once you shit it all out and kind of clear out that space, then you have the ability to process a little bit in a more pure manner. But yeah, I mean, I would love to see research in that specific field, because I've seen very profound healings, not just emotional, but also physical. And that's one of the most interesting fields, that I've heard of people. It doesn't happen all the time, but I've heard of people having various forms of cancer and undergoing ayahuasca, and then they cough up some black stuff or whatever. And some people report healings, and we can try to sweep them under the rug and say, oh, that was just a freak occurrence or whatnot. But why don't we understand the mechanism of these things better to have a more optimized healthcare system for the people?
Yeah, I agree with that completely. When I got to the Amazon, I was speaking with the local healers, and they were describing, which for me were miraculous phenomena, as if it weren't miraculous at all. That was just part of their system of medicine. And, I think if I took them to some of the clinics in the US, they would think miracles were taking place. That would be just completely described as like off the cuff. This is what we do every day of the week. And it seems to me that these are all just phenomena of a greater context of Earth that we still don't fully understand, that's connected to a greater galactic context that we don't really understand, connected to a greater, universal phenomenon. So it seems to me like, at first I was very compartmentalized in my thinking, and this was science and this was mysticism. And I started to see that there's this mystical science, that all science is mystical, and all mysticism has some kind of mechanism behind it that can also help explain it, including that of a miraculous nature to Earth itself. I've been part of miraculous healings associated with things like cancer. So I've seen where somebody has had visible, demonstrable skin cancer and coughs it out of their body, and the next day it's gone in the morning. You don't see it on their body. I've seen people with breast cancer and lung cancer spit it out and then have them tested. And so I've actually, those aren't just stories for me. Those were not even possible when I first came down here, and now I've been witness to them. So I can't say that it happens for everybody, and it's not a universal cure, but it happens for some, and it is quite miraculous when it does. And the mechanism isn't known. In a deterministic sense, the spiritual mechanism for it is, they say that the spirit of the ayahuasca works, or the spirit of the healers that come to the ceremony itself are the mechanism through which that healing is transferred. But it's allegory. It's not something that we yet have enough data and evidence for to describe in a way that makes sense. And I would like to see that happen as well.
Yeah, for sure. There was a recent study regarding, like, it was almost like an equivalent of the EEG for the brain, but EEG for the stomach. And I feel like, yeah, going forward, there's a lot of, I'm already coming up with concepts for future research regarding this specific field because I knew we need to put the spotlight on this type of stuff. I think that the healthcare system, we need to think not just US healthcare versus like European healthcare. This is global healthcare. We're all humans and we need to find optimal ways to heal the body for everybody, every sort of financial status. And I think, yeah, like looking into the ayahuasca aspect, if it could be integrated with treatment for various diseases, I think that, that's definitely in the cards for the future.
Going into the science behind it, I read a book by Lyle Watson a number of years ago. It was called Lifetide, and it describes a beautiful, fluid expression of the evolution of life, that at least known up until the 1970s. But it starts with describing the anomalies, and it says that until the anomalies are described and understood, we don't have a complete science yet. And at that, one of the anomalies he describes was a girl in Italy. I forgot which town, but it was a young girl in Italy who could stare at a tennis ball, and all of a sudden the tennis ball would be inside out. And pressurized, but felt on the inside, and they could cut into the ball, and the felt was on the inside, and the inner rubber was now the outer rubber, and same diameter of the ball, and it didn't make any sense whatsoever, and it wouldn't be studied. No one would study it. It's like it became a taboo thing to look at. And I wonder, from your experience, if you could describe what is this dissonance in science to actually being willing to study these anomalies.
Well, I think one of the first most things is that there's no kind of career path. So you'd have to be like a rogue scientist who would have to get their own funding somehow. That's one of the most difficult things for many of these scientists. You have the Society of Scientific Exploration. It's like 600 edge scientists, and they're all individual scientists working within their own spaces, but they're all lacking funding. It's not the safe route. So I think when people have the concept that intriguing things would fundamentally be studied in science, or scientists are avoiding things because they're too controversial, that's not always the case. Just there's no career path, and that's one of the biggest issues. Even with something like DMT, right? You would think that you have all these celebrities talking about it, and there's interest in the public space, but there's no government funding for it. So you need to find the private sources that are going to go ahead and support this for the young PhDs to have a career. So I think that's one of the reasons why these topics aren't well known. And then the second one would be obviously a challenge is your internal worldview. If a scientist hasn't had a strange experience or a mystical type experience, they'd be very skeptical about even taking a look at these things. So those are two factors that are definitely playing big roles in why we don't have a greater understanding of these things. And there's also the concept that these fields are studied, but the research is published in journals that aren't considered top tier. So one thing that I've come across within the sphere of science is that there's a snobbery going on where people only feel like if it's published in Nature or the Lancet or something, then it's like legit. And if it's published in a peer-reviewed journal that's maybe more obscure, then it's not done with the level of scrutiny, which isn't correct, but I understand that those are the waters that we need to navigate to change the world. So, yeah, there's some things to overcome for sure, but they can be overcome with the right perspective.
You mentioned there the journey of funding, and resonates with me. And I also really appreciate the idea that it's not always conspiracy. It's easy to go down those roads. There's some, practical explanations about what's going on. I think having a complete science someday in the future is really necessary for us to move on as a species. And so I would like to see if there was some way to move beyond the funding difficulties. You said part of your mission with DMT Quest is around funding and helping people get funding. How do you do that? What's the landscape of funding? What does that look like in a practical way?
Yeah, it's just a lot of outreach. So, like I mentioned before, I've been invited to these symposiums in the United Kingdom with Anton Bilted and the Tierenham Initiative. So an example is like we're starting the Tyringham Foundation to focus on um, like on an annual basis doing large fundraisers with high net worth individuals. Anton happens to be high net worth. I'm not. But yeah, so just outreach to people who have interest in these spaces because there are high net worth philanthropists that have affinity for these sort of concepts. You have a guy like Robert Bigelow, who's a billionaire looking to spend money on after death sort of research and things like that. Not specifically our field, but people who want to go ahead and create a bridge between modern science and mystical and the human potential. Those are the people that we tend to do outreach with. Right now, we're talking with Joe Dispenza's people and maybe Wim Hof, and maybe doing some fundraising through those avenues. But it's really wide open. It's really whoever has that deep passion to go ahead and explore more in terms of the human potential, because that's the way I like to preface it. It's not so much just mysticism without definition, but what is the human potential truly? Even at its most fundamental, how do we generate moments of insight? To how do we turn a tennis ball inside out? Right? It's all the way. It's from the top to the bottom.
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that there are people interested in this and wanting to support. Uh, I was talking recently with a Stanford researcher, and he said that the cost of a study to, focus on any of these topics, at least through their institution, would have been around $500,000. When you've gone about this and looked at it, what kind of money are we really talking about to try to get these studies done?
It's about that, yeah, because they're all going to take place at similar institutions. You're talking about UC San Diego, University of Michigan, UC Davis, Yale, Harvard. I've had discussions with researchers at all those institutions, and yeah, it's not like you can really do much with $10,000 or $20,000, which can make it a bit difficult. But I do have some, I guess, news that I can break on your podcast. We just got a team out of Georgia Tech in Florida funded to develop technology to measure DMT fluctuations in the saliva. And if this technology can be developed, it's going to bring down the cost of field work like in a tremendous way. So basically, all you need to do is take a little bit of saliva, process it through this tech, and it's only going to be like $50 a sample. So basically, if somebody wanted to measure DMT fluctuations from darkroom meditation or even just breath work or whatnot, that's going to be much more accessible. So I'm pretty excited about that. That was a thing that I've been working on for a couple of years, and that just came to fruition. So it's going to take a couple of years to develop the tech, but if it pans out, it's going to bring the cost down like a lot for that specific type of research. But like I said, the other research in other institutions, yeah, we're talking about $500,000, $1 million. It's just the nature of the game.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's fascinating about the samples. I love hearing about how the testing is changing. We just participated in a test as well. We had a group that was wanting to test an aspect of the ayahuasca ceremonies. I can't speak on it yet because it's not published yet, but really interesting that science is starting to dive into this space. And I'm glad to see it. I came from a scientific background before I got involved. And at that time, it was just a question of bias about whether you could really participate in the spiritual experiences or you just had to try to observe them and get information on it. And I was already called through my own mystical experiences and my own awakening to already be involved. So I had kind of unfortunately crossed that barrier naturally, very similar to you, just having a spontaneous awakening. These studies are starting to push the envelope, and I've heard of a study of sustained states inside DMT and now mapping the DMT visions that people are having. And I saw a book recently come out with descriptions of the pushing the envelope even further, what people are seeing and the way they're trying to describe it from the experiences. What do you know of those studies? And are you guys involved in any way? And what do you think about that?
Yeah, I know the Imperial College team. They've been part of the symposiums that I've been attending. And yeah, we just recently, well, not recently, it was last year, we secured 1.5 million for extended state DMT research at UC San Diego. So Jon Dean went from Michigan to San Diego, and he's going to be partaking in carrying out that study. He's actually going to do a hybrid study as well, where he's going to be attempting to image DMT in the human brain for the first time via MRI tech. So, yeah, regarding the extended state and the entity mapping, it's an interesting field for sure. It's a little bit out there for the average person, but I think it's necessary because a lot of people are having overlap in terms of the experience and the entities that they're seeing and whatnot. I think that the one thing that's going to be difficult is simply sheerly based on the number of participants in these studies, right? So it's not like you're having 10,000 people participating in these studies. So your sample size is going to be really small. It's going to be maybe like between Imperial College, UC San Diego, and maybe a few other sites, you might have 100, 200 people max. So that kind of limits the map that you can build based on, the limited number of people in it. But I think it's a good starting point. I think it should be integrated with, the maps of the near-death experiences that, guys like Bruce Grayson and Sam Parnia have been working on for many years. You have the dark room retreats, right, where, that are taking place all over the world, where people are mapping that space out to a certain extent. You have research at the International Academy of Consciousness and the Monroe Institute that have been mapping out, the out-of-body sort of sphere. So I think if you were to look at it from a comprehensive perspective of, extended state DMT, the out-of-body people, the near-death people, the dark room people, maybe even you can include ayahuasca in there. I think at that point, then you'd have you can build a solid foundation from there to really try to understand, what is on maybe the other side or expanded states of consciousness, what's going on. But it's still so early in the space of extended state DMT. It's really hard to tell where it's going to go.
Do you know the purpose behind the mapping and like what the idea is, or even the need to map? Like, why is it happening?
I think it's the curiosity, especially of the funder. So Anton, he's the funder for the extended state study, and he has a deep interest in that. I think because he's had profound experiences in those spaces. So he wants to help validate these aspects of the experience. So I think that's really what it boils down to. I mean, just like Bigelow, right? Bigelow's funding what he's interested in regarding survival of consciousness after bodily death. So he's going to fund that sort of stuff, and then you have Anton and other funders who are interested in that space, and that's why they're happening.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. When I was first in the Amazon drinking ayahuasca, it was all novel. And then all of a sudden I started to become aware of commonalities. And then as I was talking with the locals that would have the experiences of my teachers, they would describe even more commonalities. But I remember one of the most impactful experiences was one day when one of the people I was working with handed me a pipe. And I looked at the pipe and then I almost dropped it on the floor. And it was the first time in my life that I had seen a carving of something that I had only seen in ayahuasca vision and had no reference for whatsoever from any other mythological context. So I couldn't say, oh, that was because I went to a cathedral in Rome and it was carved into it, or I had been indoctrinated to this image and this mythology somewhere else. This was a very unique being, a very unique shape that I had seen floating around in an ayahuasca vision. And then one day it was carved in a bas relief on a pipe. And it was the first time that I had actually seen something like that. And I remember how impactful it was because it shut off a doubt inside of me that there was a commonality or a kind of, quote, realness to what was taking place in this altered state. It's very easy to, mythologically indoctrinate somebody and then have them see a similar thing. You could say, well, they're hallucinating or they were, predisposed to having that kind of experience. But this was truly something unique. I had never seen anything like it. And there it was. And then over the years, I started to understand that there is a much greater commonality that people are experiencing. The locals that I talked with, they described them as spirits. And the tribal people understood them as this phenomena called a spirit. And I was coming from a perspective that spirits were very new for me, and I didn't have a way to really understand or address what spirits were. And then all of a sudden it was like I really did understand what they were talking about. And I found a commonality in language that what I had previously been imagining as a spirit wasn't something that they were even talking about. They were using the same word to talk about this completely other foreign phenomena to me, but where there was an overlap. And so I thought this is interesting, based on the idea of being able to create maps of commonality. One part about it that is fascinating in what you just said is the idea of there being a unified map from all of these different studies coming together to just describe altered or other. We could say, okay, this is, what we consider a semi-pathological to non-pathological, common state amongst people. I don't know if anyone passes the free of all pathologies anymore, but this is common and this is other, and this is the amount of commonality in other, I think starts to create a really interesting depiction. Do you know anybody putting that together yet?
You might have to talk to Jeffrey Mishlove about that. He's the founder of the New Thinking Aloud channel. He's been looking at, I guess, a PhD in parapsychology. And I think he was talking about creating something along those lines. I have some interest in loosely sort of organizing things, but yeah, I'm more focused on high utility in the sense of like disease states, and alleviating those. But yeah, I think Mishlove might be working on that. I don't know about any other people, but yeah, it definitely needs to happen. And I think that Mishlove might be the guy to do it because he's been in the space for so long.
In your focus around disease states, what do you think is promising?
I think Alzheimer's disease, in terms of utilizing altered states, like combining things like breath work, even metabolic therapy, changing lifestyle, and then even including like ayahuasca or DMT, low levels to induce the changes in the brain and helping the brain recover. Yeah, I think that combining those things are going to be above and beyond what else is out there. I had a conversation a couple months ago with a fellow named Dale Bredesen. He's a medical doctor, has been researching Alzheimer's for decades now, and he's starting to have interest in integrating psychedelics with his metabolic therapy. Yeah, I think that's probably one of the leading aspects or the leading breakthroughs that we can have in terms of showing the world that these altered states, whether it be breathwork, hypnosis, meditation type stuff, or even in combination with psychedelics, actually have like high utility, high function disease reversal or slowing down, rather than just pure mysticism. So I think we can show the world some interesting things, focusing on neurodegenerative conditions.
Yeah, one of the things I loved about ayahuasca was that it seemed like there was three clear components working in harmony together to create the transformation. The first was just the compounds in the tea itself. There was a physical tea, and you're drinking compounds and they're powerful. And then the second one was a natural psychological effect that happened, which seemed like an unveiling of the conscious, subconscious, and unconscious mind through that altering of the process out of chemical nature. And then there was the ineffable mystical that transcended belief and faith to a real experience over an acute period of time that had equal importance to the psychological journey that somebody went on, as well as the fact that they had drunk the tea and that they knew it. And so I thought that those three aspects working in harmony were always really potent and important to the experience. And I appreciated that it didn't parse that out and isolate it from each other. You couldn't have had the psychological effect unless you had the tea, which was the physical molecules. And there was this greater other mystical experience that was part of it, especially for non-believers to have that experience. I've met a lot of people that through the mystical aspect of the experience found tremendous healing, mental, emotional healing, personal healing, and sometimes even physical healing simply through the presence of an extraordinary mystical intervention. And so I think this idea of a hybrid approach is powerful and important. Have you guys seen anything in terms of support for dementia and or Parkinson's?
This is something that we're going to actively pursuing. It's kind of something that I've been mapping out for a bit, and now we're ready to go ahead and and actively execute in terms of the outreach for the funding. But I think, yeah, there definitely is in the spaces that I've talked to. A lot of people obviously have Alzheimer's somewhere in their family. They know somebody that has that. So, yeah, it's very personal to a lot of people. And I think that's going to be one of the fields where there's going to be, yeah, significant funding to help that, especially once you come up with a pilot study of maybe, let's say, a dozen people or 15 people, and you show efficacy, then it could just take off.
Yeah, amazing. I think that's just such an important thing. Uh, I know for people who've lived through Alzheimer's and family members with Alzheimer's, the difficulty in watching the lack of memory and the lack of connection that the memory of the past and recognition creates. And a combination of that to support in any way, I find just so helpful. I'm saddened and surprised that we don't have more discovered already on it. I would like to think that we're advancing faster than the difficulty of this, and it does seem like there's a tremendous increase in the prevalence, especially as duration of life is going on. The neurodegeneration is becoming much more prevalent. We're not being, transitioned by other things, and so there's a natural degradation that takes place over time. Do you think it's possible to ultimately reverse that in some way and create forever life, forever biological life? Is the science heading in that direction?
I can't really speak on that because, like, yeah, that forever biological life isn't something that, I have a deep interest in. I'm really, after my awakening, I got so comfortable with death that it's not like I look forward to it, but I'm really comfortable with the concept and understanding that this is, just the cycle of our spiritual evolution, right? And that's what we need. We need to die and then become reborn at some point in terms of our evolution as a soul. But in terms of, yeah, disease and reversal, absolutely. I mean, you talked to Dale Bredesen. He had a documentary that came out, I think either earlier this year, late last year, showcasing some of the successes that he's had just with metabolic therapy. We're talking about dietary, meditation, exercise, and other aspects that are part of his protocol to reverse Alzheimer's. And, he's having some success. So, we just want to build from that foundation that's already there rather than, you have a lot of people who are very, I guess, excited about, just give somebody with Alzheimer's a psychedelic and then that'll heal them, but I think that it should be a holistic approach. And, you build from what's there and make things more efficient. And then you continue being more efficient and optimizing the setup. And, yeah, I think a decade from now, the perspective of Alzheimer's, especially, early and mid stage, it's going to be a different perspective. It's going to be like, yeah, we can handle that.
Amazing. I love to hear that. It gives me hope, and it seems like the direction we need to go. For you, what's next? What's interesting? What's coming? What are you doing? What would you like to share with everyone?
Yeah, so the DMT Quest aspect is not just research, it's film. So we make the films to highlight the research because not everybody reads research papers, right? And we try to translate it to a layman public perspective where they can understand it and just the content. So then, we can upgrade society, in terms of our understanding of our own biology. So right now I'm mapping out the second DMT Quest documentary. It's going to be focused on a study that was just published this year by Nick Linos at the University of Michigan, showing that DMT seems to be produced at nearly double the levels of dopamine in various parts of the cortex. So, we all know the importance of dopamine. At least that's in terms of the discussion, right? In terms of addiction or pleasure or whatnot. So, what is a psychedelic compound doing at double the levels of a commonly studied neurotransmitter like dopamine, and also tying in the angles of Alzheimer's and all that. So, working on another film, trying to get more researchers funded, and that's pretty much the big picture goal is get more research funded, do more films, and just make that consistent until we go deeper and deeper into the human potential. And this is the long game. It's going to be a long process, but ideally we can secure enough funding to speed it up a little bit.
I love hearing that, and know you have our support. I think it's fantastic, everything that you're doing. How can our audience find you, follow you, and be involved if they have some way to help?
Yeah, first thing I would say is check out the first film. Get comfortable with it so you know exactly what we're trying to do in terms of highlighting the science and the trajectory of where we're going in terms of helping people with health and disease, as well as a better understanding of mysticism. You can go to dmtquest.org, and the screenshot of the film is right at the top. Just hit the play button; it'll take you to YouTube. It's free, no ads. So I just want to make it easy viewing. And if you want to donate, there's some donate buttons there, as well as you can just reach out to me if you want to, I guess, have more dialogue regarding specific research programs. You can email me at jchavez@dmtquest.org, JCHAVEZ at dmtquest.org.
Jon, thank you so much for everything you're doing. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with you. I want to stay up on your developments and advancements. If you would like to come back on the podcast at another time, and just great to get to know you today. So thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Hamilton. And same thing with your work and all the work that you've been doing regarding ayahuasca. And I think I remember reading something about a cannabis shaman too, some time back or something along those lines. So, yeah, shout out to you for all the work you've been doing. And thanks so much for having me on the show.
Amazing. Have a beautiful day.
You too.